The pot on my stove was old. Enamel cracked in places, the kind of pot that rattled when the soup began to simmer. I stirred slowly, wooden spoons circling the broth, the hiss of the kettle on the back burner filling the silence. Outside the kitchen window, gulls screamed over the harbour, but it was not their cries that made me still my hand for half a second. It was a whisper, low, sharp, coming from just beyond the pantry door. I leaned on the spoon, pretending to study the bubbles in the soup. My stepdaughter June's voice slid through the crack like a draft. She won't fight it. She's too tired now. We just need her signature. Once the guardianship papers are filed, the sale will move fast. Guardianship. Sale. Words cold enough to chill the steam rising into my face. Mason's voice followed, smooth, practiced, like a man rehearsing charm in the mirror. We'll tell her it's routine. Just to keep things simple, make sure the house transitions smoothly. She won't question it. She trusts me. She always has. I let the spoon clink softly against the side of the pot, masking the sudden thud of my heartbeat. My eyes stayed fixed on the broth, though every word from the mudroom pierced straight through me. She doesn't need this big old place, June went on, her voice sharper now. We can fix it up, flip it, make real money before the market cools. And she'll be safe. We'll put her somewhere with nurses, someone to watch her. She'll thank us later. Safe. The word burned. They spoke of me as if I were already gone, already tucked away in some forgotten corner where no one listened to my voice anymore. The kettle began to scream, shrill and insistent. I reached over, lifted it from the flame, and poured the boiling water into 2 mugs, the steam fogging the window. My hands were steady, though inside I could feel the old fire rising. Mason chuckled then, a sound too casual, too greedy. By the time she realizes, it'll be done. Paper's stronger than memory. Trust me, June, this is how it works. I kept my back turned, spoons swirling in patient circles, my breath even, my face calm. To them, I was an aging woman making soup, rocking slowly toward forgetfulness. But I was wide awake. Every word, every careless laugh, every plan they thought was secret. I gathered it like ingredients, storing it away. One day soon I would serve it back, hotter than they could ever imagine. My front door is painted the colour of a summer sky, though the salt air has worn it softer, a little faded at the edges where the sea wind gnaws. Folks in Harbour's Edge know the house by that door, the blue one with the crooked brass knocker, and by the light that shines warm from the kitchen every Thursday evening. That door has opened to neighbours carrying pies, children with scraped knees, and fishermen with stories so tall even the lighthouse blushed. I am 62 years old, though in a place like this, age isn't measured by numbers, but by storms weathered, nets mended, and meals shared. I became a widow 12 years ago, when John passed quietly on a morning that smelled of coffee and rain. Since then, this house has been my anchor. People say it looks too big for one woman, but I tell them, it's never truly empty. On Thursdays, laughter fills the rooms, spoons scrape bowls clean, and old hymns sometimes rise from the parlour when the piano gets coaxed awake. From my porch, I can see the lighthouse, its white tower stark against the sky. At dusk, the beam sweeps across the water, steady as a heartbeat, a reminder that even in the darkest hours there is a rhythm guiding us back to shore. I like to think of it as a companion, keeping watch while I shell peas or stitch another quilt square by lamplight. The town itself is stitched together much the same way. Small shops, weather-worn docks, gossip traded as easily as clams at the market. Harbour's Edge isn't rich in money, but it's rich in memory. Every cracked boardwalk plank, every creaking screen door tells a story of someone's hands, someone's hope. Papers, signatures, contracts. Those are things that fade. But the laughter echoing in a kitchen, the quilt passed from grandmother to granddaughter, the smell of cornbread spilling out a window on a cold night, those are the things that last. I keep a recipe card tucked in the Bible by my bed. The ink has blurred from years of butter stains and candlelight. John's handwriting lists the ingredients for oyster stew, though he always forgot to write the pinch of cayenne that made it his. That card, smudged and simple, is worth more than any stack of legal documents Mason could wave in my face. It is proof of love lived, not just words on a line. This place, my house, my blue door, my lighthouse at dusk. It belongs not to banks or buyers, but to people who remember, and as long as I breathe, I intend to keep it that way. When June first came into my life, she was just a thin girl with eyes too old for her age. Her mother had passed sudden, a sickness that took her before anyone could even say goodbye. John brought June to my doorstep one grey afternoon, his arm around her shoulders, his face lined with the kind of sorrow that never fully leaves. I opened that blue door and she stepped inside, quiet, uncertain, carrying her grief like a heavy satchel. In those first years, we managed a kind of peace. I tried not to mother her too hard. Just enough supper on her plate, just enough clean laundry folded at the end of her bed. Sometimes she'd sit with me in the kitchen, helping shell beans or flipping through recipe cards, pretending not to listen when I hummed old hymns. Other times she kept to herself, lost in books or staring out at the lighthouse beam like it was the only thing steady in her world. When John passed, the air between us grew thinner, stretched tight like old fabric. We still spoke, still smiled, but it was careful, like walking across ice that might crack. She was no longer the girl with tired eyes, but a young woman. And I was the woman left to carry both our griefs. Then Mason came. He walked into our lives with a handshake too polished, a smile that gleamed like a coin rubbed too often. People in town said he was ambitious, that he had big plans. To me, his charm always felt borrowed, like a suit a man wears to a wedding but never truly owns. He called me Mom, in a voice a shade too smooth, and though I kept my expression polite, something in me stayed alert. The small cuts began then. Mason would laugh at my mismatched silverware, say how we could upgrade to a proper set. June echoed him. It's just a suggestion, nothing serious, but I noticed soon enough when the old heirloom spoons vanished from the drawer. The photo of John on the mantel, the one with the corner torn, was nudged aside to make room for some glossy framed picture of a vacation I'd never been part of. Modernise, Mason would say, running his hand along the wooden banister John had polished every spring. Fresh paint, new appliances, maybe knock down a wall or two. This old place could be worth triple if we made it shine. I'd smile, stir my tea, let their words pass like a draft under the door. But inside each little cut drew blood. Not enough to make me cry out, just enough to remind me that love and loyalty were slipping away, one harmless suggestion at a time. It was a Sunday afternoon when Mason arrived with that grin of his and a manila folder tucked under his arm. June followed a step behind, her heels clicking sharp against the porch boards, her eyes darting like she was already rehearsing the victory. I was at the table with my quilt pieces spread out, but I cleared them away and set down 3 plates instead. Cobbler was in the oven, peach and cinnamon, and the smell carried through the house like a shield. Mason laid the folder on the table as if he were setting down something harmless. Just some routine insurance updates, he said, his voice dipped in honey. We thought it best to go over them with you now. Keep everything simple. June leaned in, tapping the folder with her manicured nail. It's nothing complicated, really. Just a few signatures so we don't run into confusion later. Everyone does this. I nodded slowly, sliding my glasses up the bridge of my nose. Of course, I said, pulling the folder closer. I let the silence stretch a beat too long before opening it. Careful, deliberate. My finger traced the titles at the top of each page. Durable power of attorney. Guardianship declaration. Transfer of property rights. Mason shifted in his chair, his smile tightening like a belt pulled 1 notch too far. Yes, ma'am. Just standard clauses, you know. Won't take but a minute. I turned another page, reading the bold letters out loud, my voice even, unhurried. Designation of trustee. Sale authorization. I paused, tapping the edge of the paper with my spoon from the cobbler dish. So thorough. The oven timer chimed, sharp and cheerful, and I rose without hurry. I pulled the cobbler out, steam curling like a blessing, and set it in the middle of the table. "Let's have a bite first," I said with a smile. "No sense in doing business on an empty stomach." They each took a plate, though neither seemed to taste it. I savoured mine, slow, watching them squirm as the sweet filled the room heavier than their scheme. When Mason cleared his throat and asked again about my signature, I set down my fork, dabbing my lips with a napkin. "Well now," I said, "I never sign anything without giving it a good read. You wouldn't expect less from me, would you?" He laughed, a hollow sound, but closed the folder with a snap. June muttered something about me always dragging things out. I just smiled and rose to collect the plates. Later, after the screen door banged shut behind them, I sat back at the table, pulled out my phone, and typed a message to Lila. "Old friend, trusted friend, paralegal with sharper eyes than mine. Need you to look at some papers," I wrote. "Come by soon. Bring your red pen." That evening, after the cobbler plates were washed and stacked, I walked the house the way some folks walk a church, quiet, reverent, listening for echoes. Each room had its own sermon. In the parlour, John's guitar still leaned against the wall, a thin film of dust softening its shine. In the hallway, the faded runner rug showed the path our feet had worn, children's footsteps once chasing toward bedtime, laughter bubbling like creek water. The kitchen, my kingdom, smelled of cinnamon and onions, of every supper that had bound this place together like stitches in cloth. I touched the banister, smooth from years of polish, and remembered John running his palm along it before heading out to sea. The dining room window still bore the faint scratches from when June was small, when she pressed seashells against the glass to show the light how pretty they were. Even the walls, cracked in places, seemed to breathe with memory. Lifetime, I thought. That's what these rooms held. Not numbers, not price tags. Lifetime. The next morning I dressed plain but firm, navy skirt, white blouse, John's silver brooch at my collar, and drove to town. The office of the Coastal Land Trust was modest, tucked between a bait shop and the hardware store. Inside, the air smelled of paper and pine cleaner. The director, a woman named Margaret with hair as white as sea foam, shook my hand warmly. "You're certain about this?" she asked, her eyes kind but steady. "I am," I said. "I want this house, this land to belong to more than me. I want it to teach, to feed, to keep its light burning." We spread the papers across her desk, thick pages covered in legal print. She slid a pen toward me, but I didn't rush. I laid out a quilt square first, patches sewn from John's shirts, blue and green like water and sky. "This house will be the lighthouse kitchen and quilt school," I told her. "A place where anyone can learn, eat, stitch, remember." Margaret smiled. "Then let's make it official." The pen moved steady in my hand, looping my name with care. With each stroke, I felt weight lift from my shoulders, not loss, but protection. When she pressed the notary stamp down, the sound echoed like a gavel, quiet but final. I folded the signed deed into a folder of my own, tucking the quilt square inside with it. Lifetime residency was mine, my right to live here until my last breath, but the future now belonged to something greater. As I stepped back into the sunlight, the lighthouse beams swept faintly even in the day. I felt the walls of my house standing taller already, whispering back to me, safe now, safe for good. Every Thursday, when the sun slid low and the gulls began their noisy flight toward the docks, my kitchen filled with the voices of women who had learned how to survive. We called ourselves the Teacup Circle, though the name had started as a joke years ago. The truth was our teacups were chipped, the saucers mismatched, the spoons bent, but the circle itself was strong as iron. There was Mary Ellen, whose shrimping boat had been splintered by a hurricane, but who found a way to keep fishing with little more than a net and stubborn faith. There was Clarice, who buried 2 husbands and raised 3 boys on her own wages, sewing hems until her fingers bled. Ruth, the quietest of us, carried a grief no one could name, but her prayers could soften the hardest night. And Lila, my oldest friend, sharp-eyed paralegal with a laugh like a crow, she could sniff out a lie faster than a hound dog. We never missed a Thursday. Some weeks we had gumbo, some weeks cornbread and beans, but always biscuits in a basket lined with an old towel. Always the teacups, their rims worn thin, clinking soft as bells. We talked about storms and gardens, children and taxes, the aches in our backs and the jokes that still made us blush like girls. In the centre of the table sat a mason jar with a strip of paper taped across it. Circle Fund. A few dollars dropped in whenever someone had a little extra, pulled out when someone couldn't make rent or needed medicine. No questions, no shame, no keeping score. The jar was never full, but it was never empty either. That evening, as the biscuits steamed and the circle's chatter rose around me, I poured the tea and listened. I did not tell them about Mason's folder or June's whispers. Not yet. I let Clarice tell about her grandson's wedding, let Mary Ellen describe the size of the redfish that got away, let Ruth read aloud a psalm she had written in her notebook. I set places, passed butter, kept the pot hot. There is power in listening, more than most realize. While their voices rose and fell, I felt steadier, as if each word, each laugh, was a stitch tightening the fabric of my resolve. When the evening wound down and the last crumb was brushed away, Lila caught my eye across the table. She didn't ask, not in front of the others, but her look said clear as words, "Tell me when you're ready." I nodded, gathering the chipped cups. The teacup circle was not about secrets. It was about strength, and mine had just been sharpened. Soon enough, I would share. But for that night, I let their voices be the shelter I needed most. It was June who brought it up first, her tones syrupy sweet, but her eyes sharp as glass. "Mama, we just think it would be good for everyone's peace of mind if you had a little checkup. You know, make sure you're still sharp, still capable. Nothing to worry about." She tried to smile like it was kindness, but I could feel the blade beneath it. Mason stood beside her, arms folded, nodding like a man who'd already made the appointment in his head. I stirred sugar into my coffee, slow circles, then set the spoon down. "That's a fine idea," I said softly, and I meant it, but not in the way they thought. The very next morning I called Dr. Harris, my own geriatrician, the one who had known me since my first grey hair and never once treated me like a relic. His office smelled of lemons and old books, and when he walked in with my chart, he raised a brow. "Cognitive exam? You sure about this?" I smiled. "I'm sure." The test was no burden. A list of words to repeat, a clock to draw, a series of questions that felt more like riddles for children. I answered each one steady, clear. When he asked me to count backward by sevens, I went all the way down to single digits without missing a beat. When he asked me to recall the words, I recited them like scripture. Dr. Harris chuckled, tapping his pen. "You're sharper than half my staff." He signed the letter himself, bold ink across the page, declaring me fully competent and fit to manage my own affairs. He slid it into an envelope sealed with his practice stamp. "Keep this somewhere safe," he said. I drove home with the envelope on the seat beside me, the sun slanting gold through the windshield. Back at the house, I tucked it deep into the locked drawer of my desk, beneath John's fishing license and my mother's Bible. Then I prepared something else, a decoy. I pulled a plain envelope from the drawer, slipped in a blank piece of paper, and sealed it with a red wax stamp I'd kept from my quilting guild. On the outside, I wrote in careful cursive, "Property and Care Documents." I left it right on top of the desk, where curious fingers would not be able to resist. That night, as I hung my reading glasses on their chain and turned down the lamp, I felt a quiet satisfaction. Let them snoop. Let them think they'd found treasure. The real prize was locked away, and I was the one holding the key. The morning of the appointment, June insisted on driving, though Mason slid behind the wheel as if the car already belonged to him. I sat in the back seat with my hands folded, watching the tide pools flash silver along the roadside. Mason kept glancing at me in the rearview mirror, smiling like he was escorting a child to school. The clinic waiting room smelled faintly of disinfectant, but sunlight poured through the tall windows, warming the leaves of a potted fern by the door. I checked in, signed my name clear and bold, then settled into a chair while June filled the air with nervous chatter. Mason kept his hand on the clipboard the nurse brought over, trying to peek at the forms as though I'd forgotten how to read. When my name was called, he rose with me, answering questions that hadn't even been asked. "She forgets things sometimes," he told the nurse. "She gets confused about dates." His voice was smooth, confident, but I caught the flicker in her eyes as she looked at me directly. Inside the exam room, the doctor entered with a stethoscope slung around his neck and a stack of papers in hand. He glanced once at Mason, then at me. "All right, let's talk," he said. "Mrs. Whitfield, these questions are for you." Mason shifted in his chair, lips parting as if to jump in, but I met his eyes just long enough to make him close them again. The doctor began. "Can you tell me today's date?" I answered without pause, giving the exact day and year. "Now count backward from 100 by sevens." My voice was steady as I stepped down through the numbers one after another, until even the doctor laughed softly. "That's enough. You'll have me dizzy." He asked me to draw a clock, to recall a short list of words, to explain a simple proverb. I did each task carefully, clearly, and when he looked up from his notes, his expression was plain respect. He addressed me directly, not Mason, not June. Me. When it was done, he signed the letter on his clipboard, tore it off, and slid it across the desk. "You're perfectly capable," he said firmly. "Don't let anyone tell you otherwise." I folded the letter once, then again, slipping it into my bag. The paper felt light, but the weight it lifted from me was heavy as stone. Respect, I realized as we walked back through the sunlit hallway, is a tonic. It doesn't erase the years, but it makes them strong. I nodded my thanks to the doctor, passed the fern by the door and walked out taller than I had walked in. They came on a Thursday, the folder tucked under Mason's arm again, only this time he wasn't alone. A man in a grey suit followed close behind, carrying a briefcase and wearing a smile polished thin. "This is our friend Calvan," Mason said, his voice heavy with pride. "He's a notary. He'll make everything official." June carried herself like a hostess already, her eyes sweeping my kitchen as though she were measuring curtains for a future that didn't belong to her. "We thought it would be best to get this done quickly," she said. "Smooth. Easy." I nodded, stirring the pot on the stove. "Of course. I've got a big supper tonight. You don't mind if we do this with company, do you?" They froze a little at that, but before they could answer, the screen door squeaked, and in came Mary Ellen with her biscuit basket, Clarice with her coleslaw, and Ruth carrying 2 pies wrapped in dish towels. Behind them trailed neighbours from up the street, laughing, shaking off the evening air, filling my kitchen with the warmth of voices. I set the long farmhouse table myself, ladling soup into bowls, steam rising in fragrant curls. Mason's notary friend perched at the far end, his briefcase on his knees, clearly unprepared for the company. June's smile looked more like a grimace now, her eyes darting from face to face. When the soup had been served and the chatter filled the air, I tapped the edge of Mason's folder with the ladle. "Well now," I said, "since we've got an official here, let's be thorough. Why don't you read each page out loud, Calvan, so we can all hear what it is I'm signing?" The chatter stilled, spoons paused in mid-air. The notary blinked, his polished smile faltering. "Oh, that won't be necessary, ma'am. It's just routine language. You don't want to bore your guests." I leaned one elbow on the table, spoon still in my hand. "I'd like to hear it," I said. My voice was calm but steady as the lighthouse beams sweeping the harbour. And so would they, I reckon. All eyes turned toward the man in the grey suit. He shifted, cleared his throat, shuffled the papers. The notary stamp sat untouched at his elbow, the ink pad dry. Mason's jaw tightened. June's face went pale. I ladled another scoop of soup into my bowl, smiling as though nothing were amiss. Around the table, neighbours leaned forward, waiting. The steam from the bowls curled upward like a silent witness, and in that thickening quiet, their little scheme began to tremble. After they left that night, folder still unopened, stamp still dry, I sat alone at the kitchen table with a book far older than any of Mason's papers. Not a Bible, though that lay close at hand. This was my ledger, cloth-bound and faded, corners frayed from years of turning. I opened it slow, smoothing the fragile pages with my palm. Each line was a memory. The year the hurricane tore half the shingles from the roof. I wrote down the nails bought, the neighbours who showed up with hammers, the pies I baked in thanks. Another page held the note of a loan repaid, $20 I'd slipped to Ruth when her light bill was due, scribbled back to me months later with an extra $5 tucked in. There was the season Mary Ellen lost her boat, and I marked the baskets of shrimp she repaid in pieces one by one, until the debt was settled with laughter instead of coins. Clarice's boy needed books for school once, and my pencil stub noted the cost, the date. She returned it years later in the form of labour, painting my porch rail white while his own children played in the yard. Pressed between 2 pages, brittle but intact, was a magnolia leaf from the spring John and I planted the tree out front. I'd written beneath it, "Storm took the shed, but spared the bloom." That bloom had opened each year since, a reminder that loss doesn't have the final word. I kept no grand sums, no neat totals at the bottom. It wasn't money I was counting, it was patience, kindness, storms endured. Each entry was small, sometimes almost laughable, but together they stacked higher than any bank ledger could. Patience is interest, compounding slow. A kindness given returns in its own time. A no spoken in anger softens when written down with care. I was never powerless, though June and Mason wanted to see me that way. I was saving strength, saving truth, saving the weight of quiet witness. I closed the ledger gently, the pencil stub tucked inside, the magnolia leaf whispering faint against the paper. The walls of this house might creak, the paint might peel, but the record of what had been built here was stronger than ink. When the time came, I knew I would not need to shout. I would simply open my ledger, written not in numbers but in years, and show that power has many forms. Some are loud. Mine was patient. Mine was waiting. The first time June tried the old spare key, I heard it before I saw it. A faint scrape at the back door one afternoon, the kind of sound you notice when you've lived in the same house long enough to know its every breath. I stayed quiet in the parlour, listening. The knob jiggled, then the key turned. Stopped hard. A little curse slipped from her lips. I could picture her face tight with frustration. I had changed the locks the week before. New brass key, cut sharp, cool in my pocket. I'd given a copy only to Lila, just in case. The old keys looked the same, but they fit nothing now. Later, at the market, my mail lady, sweet Barbara with her red curls, told me Mason had been awfully friendly at the post boxes. He kept asking if I could deliver his mother-in-law's mail straight to him, since you were getting forgetful, she said, her eyebrows raised. I told him federal law doesn't forget, honey. We both laughed, but beneath mine was a steady beat of anger. When people can't take what they want, they'll often try the back ways, the locks, the mail, the weak spots. But this old house has no weak spots left. That evening I stood on the porch with a ladder, unscrewing the bulb above the door. I replaced it with a new one, heavy in my hand, fitted with a small camera no bigger than a thumbprint. It clicked in place and the porch light glowed steady, casting a warm halo. A tiny sticker with a camera icon gleamed on the frame. Legal, visible, honest. I stepped back, brushed my hands clean on my skirt, and looked at that blue door, now lit by more than just the bulb. Let them try, I whispered. Inside, I slipped the new brass key onto my chain and hung it by the kitchen window where it caught the last streak of sunset. I poured myself tea and watched the lighthouse beams sweep across the water, slow, faithful, never fooled by shadows. They thought of me as soft, forgetful, easy to trick. But keys that don't fit are just metal, and charm without truth is just noise. I had no need to slam doors or raise my voice. I simply made sure the locks turned for me and only me. The kettle hissed, the porch light hummed, and my house stood watch with me, both of us awake, both of us waiting. I printed the flyers on the old machine at the library, the ink a little smudged at the corners, but the words bold and plain. Lighthouse kitchen dedication and recipe swap. Saturday at noon. All welcome. I tacked the first one on the corkboard at the market, between a notice for a lost cat and a church bake sale. By sundown, copies were hanging in the post office, the diner, even the bait shop. Curiosity spread faster than the ink. At the hardware store, I overheard two men wondering if I was finally selling the house, turning it into a cafe. At the beauty parlour, Clarice told me she'd already copied her grandmother's biscuit recipe to bring along. By the time I walked into the pharmacy, folks were already buzzing. Dedication. What's she dedicating? Is the old place changing hands? Mason heard the talk too. He strutted up my porch with a grin, waving one of the flyers like it was his own invitation. Smart move, he said. Soft launch, huh? Get the town excited before the sale goes through. You'll have buyers lined up in no time. He winked, as if we shared a secret. I offered him lemonade on the porch and said nothing. Let him stew in his own guesses. June, though, took it as her stage. She came to supper in a new white dress, crisp as linen in sunlight, her hair curled into careful waves. Dedications are important, she told me, her voice pitched just loud enough for the neighbours to overhear. People remember who stands in the front. She smiled, sweet as sugar. But I saw the calculation behind her eyes. On my kitchen counter, beside the recipe cards and stacks of folded napkins, lay the shears and the length of red ribbon I'd bought from the general store. They thought it was for show, for photographs, for a moment of ceremony before the real deal began. They didn't understand yet that dedication meant more than a bow to cut. It meant permanence, a line drawn bold as ink. I smoothed the flyers into a neat stack, tucking one into my Bible beside John's oyster stew recipe card. Outside, the porch light glowed steady, watching over the house. The town was coming, with their recipes and their questions. Mason and June would be there too, dressed for celebration, expecting profit. I smiled to myself as I tied the red ribbon into a loose loop. Let them dress up. Let them dream. Dedication has a way of revealing who truly belongs and who never did. And who never. The town gathered in the yard that Saturday, the lighthouse beams sweeping faintly even in daylight, gulls circling as if they too were curious. Long tables were set with crockpots and baskets of biscuits, recipe cards stacked like treasures waiting to be traded. Children darted between the chairs, their laughter high and sharp against the low hum of neighbourly chatter. At the front of the porch, I stood with the red ribbon stretched between two posts, the shears glinting in my hand. Mason hovered near the notary, his grin wide and fixed. June stood close by, her white dress bright as a flag, nodding at the crowd like she was already mistress of the house. When I stepped to the microphone, their eyes locked on me with expectation, smug as a sealed envelope. I cleared my throat, voice steady, letting the hush fall over the yard. Thank you, Harbour's Edge. You've filled this home with your laughter, your recipes, your prayers. This house has never been just mine. It's always belonged to the hands and hearts that kept it standing. Applause rippled gentle, respectful. I let it fade before I reached down and pulled the cloth from the plaque fixed to the porch wall. Bronze letters caught the sun. Lighthouse Kitchen and Quilt School, held in trust by the Coastal Land Conservancy, dedicated to community teaching and fellowship. Not for sale. Not for mortgage. Not for flipping. The crowd gasped, a wave rolling through them. Clarice clapped first, then Mary Ellen, and soon the yard thundered with applause. June's face drained of colour, her smile freezing in place like plaster cracking. Mason's grin collapsed entirely, his jaw clenching as he stared at the words carved permanent in bronze. I held up one hand for quiet. And since some wondered why I made this choice, let me share a reminder. Words spoken beneath my own roof. I pressed a button on the small speaker tucked by the mic. My porch camera's recording spilled out into the air, Mason's voice smooth and smug. "Paper's stronger than memory. She'll sign without knowing," the crowd murmured. Then June's sharper tone followed. "She doesn't need this big old place. We'll put her somewhere with nurses. She'll thank us later." A low hiss of disapproval swept through the neighbours. Mason paled, shifting on his feet, the notary shrinking behind him. I looked out at the town, at my teacup circle smiling proud, at the lighthouse beam flashing once against the horizon. "This house is not a prize to be won," I said. "It is a table set for many, and now it will stay that way." The scissors closed clean on the ribbon, and the cheer that rose drowned every scheme they had carried in their pockets. After the dedication, silence spread through town faster than fire. Not the silence of peace, but the silence of turned heads, of conversations clipped short when Mason and June walked into a room. I didn't have to lift a finger. The words they'd spoken in my kitchen were still echoing in the ears of Harbour's Edge. And folks here have long memories when it comes to betrayal. June's friends, the ones who used to call her every other day with gossip and plans, stopped dialing her number. At the market, I watched one of them glance at her by the produce bins, then quickly pretend to study a pile of onions instead. Mason strutted less after that, his shoulders slumped a little more each time the cafe door didn't open for him, each time the fishermen outside the bait shop folded their arms instead of offering a handshake. I didn't feed the talk. I cooked. Cornbread cooled on a rack by the window, steam curling like soft smoke. Pots of chowder simmered for the Thursday circle, pies baked golden and sweet. When people stopped by my porch to offer sympathy, I handed them biscuits instead. Food speaks louder than bitterness, and I preferred to let the butter do the talking. The teacup circle stepped up too. We decided to hold our first lighthouse kitchen class, soups and stews from the sea. Ruth read recipes aloud while Clarice and Mary Ellen chopped onions, and Lila kept the ledger open for anyone who wanted to drop $1 into the Circle Fund jar. The room filled with laughter, the kind that smells of onions and salt air, tears falling but not from sorrow. I saw faces glow with pride as they tasted their own work, neighbours young and old sharing spoons around the table. That was the dedication I wanted people to remember. Not a plaque on the wall, but the sound of togetherness. Mason, meanwhile, took to the internet. He posted a long message on Facebook, all about family betrayal and rights stolen. He painted himself as a victim, a man wronged by a stubborn old woman. But the words landed like a wet match. The comments beneath were not sympathy, but questions. About the recording, about the notary, about the greed written all over his face. Within hours, the post vanished, deleted like chalk washed from a board. I didn't smile, didn't gloat. I slid my phone onto the counter, screen muted, and checked the oven. The cornbread was ready, golden at the edges, humming quiet proof that silence, when chosen, can burn hotter than flame. The storm came in sudden, the way Carolina storms often do, sky turning the colour of pewter, gulls vanishing inland, wind snapping the clothesline rope till it sang like a whip. The radio crackled warnings all afternoon, and by dusk the town was out stacking sandbags, latching shutters, tying down what couldn't be carried inside. I moved through the rooms steady, lighting candles, checking the lantern, setting water jugs on the counter. When the first clap of thunder rattled the blue door, the power blinked and then died, leaving the house in the hush of storm breath. The porch light camera winked out, but my flashlight halos swept the kitchen, turning every shadow into silver. It was near midnight when I heard the frantic knock. Rain drummed on the roof, sheets of it. But through the pain, I saw June. Hair plastered to her face, dress soaked clear through. She pushed inside the moment I opened the door, shaking like a reed in wind. "He left," she gasped. "Mason, he took my car, he took the envelope from your desk." The decoy. I almost smiled but didn't. Her eyes were wide, hunted, the bravado gone. She sank against the wall, dripping water on the floorboards. I fetched a towel from the linen chest, pressed it into her hands, then set a broom by the door. "Storm's not waiting," I said. "No lecture, no scolding, just work. Work is love with sleeves rolled." She blinked at me, stunned, but when I bent to sweep water sneaking under the doorframe, she bent too, pushing her damp hair back, shoulders trembling as she moved. Together we cleared the puddle, wrung rags into the bucket, shifted furniture away from the drafty window. The thunder growled low, the house shivered, but our hands stayed busy, steady. Hours passed that way, patching, sweeping, mopping by lantern light. At some point, June whispered, "He said he was going to sell everything, that I didn't need you anymore." Her voice cracked like the sky outside. I didn't answer. Sometimes silence is softer than pity. When dawn broke grey and hollow, the storm still muttering far out at sea, the house stood intact. We stood too, wet, sore, exhausted, but standing. June sat at the table with the towel around her shoulders, face pale but calmer. I set the broom against the doorframe, the wood worn smooth from our hands, and poured her a cup of strong coffee. Work had steadied us both more than words ever could, and for the first time in years, she accepted what I gave her without complaint. When the worst of the storm had passed, the town still sat in darkness. Power lines lay tangled across the road, and the hum of a lone generator filled the air like a heartbeat. Harbour's edge needed feeding, linemen hauling poles through the mud, nurses keeping the shelter calm, families clutching babies in borrowed blankets. The lighthouse kitchen opened its doors that night not for ceremony but for survival. I hauled out the big pots, the ones that could swallow 20 pounds of beans at a time. June followed, quiet at first, watching as I soaked beans in tubs, chopped onions by lantern light, kept the coffee urn filled and hissing. Volunteers drifted in. Mary Ellen with shrimp, Clarice with flour, Ruth with jars of pickles, and the rhythm took hold. Stir, ladle, serve, refill. A song older than any hymn. June lingered near the counter, uncertain, until a baby fussed in his mother's arms. I pressed a spoon into her hand and nodded toward the pot. "Stir slow, keep it from catching," I told her, and slipped away to take the infant so the mother could eat. His tiny breath warmed my shoulder as I rocked him near the quilt laid out in the corner. Children curled like kittens across its patches. When I returned, June was bent over the pot, hair frizzed from steam, cheeks flushed. She lifted the ladle carefully, filling bowls for men in reflective vests. Her voice soft as she thanked each one. They thanked her back, their tired faces easing just a little with every bite. I poured coffee for the nurses, their hands trembling from too many hours awake. June followed with biscuits, her steps growing sure. At some point she laughed, a small sound at first, then fuller, unguarded. I hadn't heard that sound from her in years. The kitchen pulsed like a living thing, boots scuffing, spoons clinking, voices rising and fading. Outside the wind still groaned, but inside the lanterns glowed steady, the generator hummed its faithful note. Near dawn, I caught June leaning against the counter, smiling as she wiped her brow. She looked out over the room, neighbours fed, children asleep safe, men and women warmed, and for once there was no calculation in her eyes, only wonder. I placed a hand on her shoulder just for a moment. She didn't pull away. That night, between the hum of the generator and the hiss of the coffee urn, I saw the first stitch pulled tight between us again. Not mended yet, not whole, but the fabric no longer torn clear through. The call came just after sunrise, the storm clouds broken apart and the streets washed clean with rain. The old phone on my kitchen wall rattled to life, its ring sharp in the quiet. I lifted the receiver, pressing it to my ear, and heard Sheriff Turner's voice, low and steady. "Mrs. Whitfield, we've got something you need to know. Mason tried to open a line of credit in your name down in Wilmington. Bank security caught it on video, clear as day. He had your driver's license number, forged signature, the works. They're ready to press charges if you say the word." I sat at the table, my eyes on the blue door where droplets still clung like pearls from the night's storm. "And if I don't?" I asked. "Then it dies quiet," he said. "But the evidence is ironclad. He won't wriggle out easy. It's your choice." I closed my eyes a moment, letting the weight of it settle. Jail would break him, but perhaps not change him. Vengeance burns fast and leaves little behind. I thought of the ledger I kept, the circle jar on the table, the women who believed in debts that heal. "I'll press, on conditions," I said at last. "Restitution. Every cent he owes, plus more, funneled straight into the Circle Fund. A stay-away order for me and mine. And if the DA has room for mercy, let him serve his hours here. Community work, supervised, feeding, mending, building something that lasts. Justice ought to mend, not just punish." There was a pause on the line, then a soft chuckle. "You always did have your own brand of law, Ma'am. I'll speak with the DA." When I set the phone back on its hook, the house seemed to exhale with me. Rain-washed light spilled across the floorboards, bright and clean. I pulled out a sheet of paper, wrote my statement by hand, and signed it clear at the bottom. No wavering. Outside, the street glistened, every puddle a mirror for the sky. Children splashed in rubber boots, men hauled branches to the curb, neighbours waving to one another as if the storm had tied them tighter. I stepped onto the porch, the air smelling of wet pine and salt, and thought how justice should feel like this, like rain rinsing the dust away, leaving something fresh, something possible. I did not smile. I simply breathed deep, steady, knowing the choice was mine, and it was the right one. The storm left branches scattered across the yard, shingles torn from the roof, and the herb garden flattened under a mat of wet leaves. The next morning, when the sun broke through, the soil steamed faintly, rich and dark, waiting to be worked again. I stepped outside with a basket and gloves, expecting to labour alone. But June was already there, crouched among the ruins, her hair tied back, dirt smeared on her cheek. She didn't look up at first, just pulled handfuls of soggy leaves away from the rosemary bush, her fingers trembling. The air smelled sharp and green where the sprigs had broken. I knelt beside her without a word, sinking my hands into the soil, feeling its damp weight press under my nails. For a long while we worked in silence. She gathered, I clipped, we both pressed fresh seedlings into place. The earth gave willingly, soft after rain, and soon neat rows began to form where ruin had been. Finally, June sat back on her heels, wiping her brow with the back of her wrist. "I thought money would fix everything," she whispered. "Mason made it sound so easy. Sell, move, start fresh. I wanted to believe him. Maybe I didn't want to see what I was giving up." I pressed a sprig of rosemary into the ground, firming the soil around it. "Grief blinds us," I said. "Losing your mother, losing your father, it left holes too big to patch with cash. But chasing easy money only tears them wider." Her eyes filled, but she didn't turn away. "I'm sorry," she said simply. No excuses, no blame. Just the words I'd been waiting for, though I hadn't known it until they came. I laid my hand lightly on hers, dirt and all. "Then let's keep what matters," I answered. Not a ceremony, not forgiveness wrapped in ribbons, just the truth, plain as soil under our nails. The sun slid out fully then, gilding the garden in light. Bees hummed around the lavender, children's voices carried faint from down the street. and the blue door of the house stood open to the fresh air. We went back to planting, shoulder to shoulder, sweat running, hands black with earth. The garden would grow again, slow, steady, rooted. And so would we, in whatever shape the future allowed. Sometimes what we keep isn't gold or land or pride. It's the rosemary sprig that pushes through after a storm, the dirt pressed into the lines of your hand, the chance to begin again without fanfare. That was enough. More than enough. The smell of simmering broth drifted through the lighthouse kitchen, mingling with the yeasty warmth of fresh bread cooling on the racks. Folding chairs scraped across the floor as neighbours filled the room, their chatter bubbling like the pots on the stove. Today wasn't just another Thursday supper. Today was the first Soups and Stories class, the grand opening of what I had quietly built into the deed months before. The long table gleamed with mismatched bowls and stacks of recipe cards written in every hand imaginable, some shaky, some bold, all treasured. On the far wall, I had pinned a string where Polaroids would hang. By the end of the night, I wanted it sagging under the weight of new beginnings. I stood near the front, a pair of ribbon shears resting in my palm. The room hushed, like the sea pulling back before a wave. "This kitchen," I said, my voice carrying over the pots, "was never meant for one set of hands alone. It belongs to all of us, our recipes, our stories, our second chances." Eyes turned toward me, some shining, some curious. I drew a breath. And tonight, I want to name something in honor of the man who taught me patience in planting and perseverance in storms. My late husband, Samuel Carter. I unfolded a slip of paper and laid it on the table. From the ledger I've kept all these years, the one filled with debts repaid and mercies counted, I've carved out a scholarship. It's small, but it's steady. Any woman over 50 in Harbour's Edge who wants to start again, whether with a craft, a class, or a business, can apply. It will be called the Samuel Carter Second Chance Fund. The teacup circle let out a cheer that rattled the teacups on the shelf. Hands clapped, voices rose, and someone dabbed their eyes with a napkin. I glanced at June. She stood at the edge of the crowd, her face open, softer than I'd seen in years. Then, slowly, she stepped forward, holding out the scissors. "Here," she said, "you should cut it." For a moment I saw the girl she once was, the one who'd lost her mother too soon, the one I tried to love through grief and silence. I took the scissors from her hand, our fingers brushing. Together we cut the ribbon. The room erupted in applause. A Polaroid clicked. The first photo fluttered out, showing a crowded kitchen, a ribbon falling, and two women holding scissors side by side. It went up on the wall, the first of many. The soup was ladled, the stories began, and the lighthouse kitchen took its first breath of true life. Evening settled like a quilt across Harbour's Edge, the lighthouse winking its slow, steady eye over the water. I sat on the porch with a shawl around my shoulders, the wooden spoon I'd carried through every chapter of this battle resting across my lap. It wasn't just a kitchen tool, it was the weight of years, the stir of soups that fed storms of neighbours, the rhythm that kept my grief from turning to stone. The gulls called faintly offshore, and the last of the day's warmth clung to the boards under my feet. Inside, the house was quiet again. Pots washed, tables cleared, chairs stacked. But the laughter still lingered in the air, like steam refusing to fade. I thought of June's hesitant smile, of the ribbon falling in two neat halves, of the Polaroid pinned to the wall that proved we'd stood together, at least for that moment. People had asked me if I felt vindicated, if the unveiling of the plaque or the scholarship had been my revenge. But that was never the point. I didn't need to win over anyone, not Mason, not June, not even the whispers of a town that can turn colder than an east wind. What I needed was to stand rooted in truth, the way the oak in my yard had weathered storm after storm. They mistook my silence for surrender. They mistook my patience for weakness. But what they never understood is that silence can be the deepest kind of strength. It gives you room to count. Count your ingredients. Count your minutes. Count the people who are worth the saving. And yes, count the lies whispered just loud enough to hear. I ran my thumb along the worn handle of the spoon. It was smooth, almost polished from decades of stirring. Gumbo, chowder, stews for neighbours who'd lost their roofs, and cobblers sweet enough to carry families through funerals. This spoon had measured out resilience more faithfully than any clock. The beam from the lighthouse swept across the porch, a soft pulse that reminded me of my husband's heartbeat when I used to rest against him after long days. Life keeps moving, whether we're ready or not, and all we can do is stir what's in the pot we've been given. Slow, steady, careful not to scorch it. I smiled to myself, breathing in the salt and the hush of the tide. Then I said it out loud, the line I knew would outlive me, the one I wanted carried from porch to porch, kitchen to kitchen. If they think you're only stirring soup, let them think it, until it's time to serve the lesson hot. What part of this story touched you the most? Share your thoughts in the comments. I'd love to read them. If this story felt close to your heart, give it a like, subscribe if you want to be part of a space where real stories matter. Got a couple more minutes? Check out the next story. It's also about the things we rarely say out loud.